This video looks at the work of the French scholar Michel Foucault through the lens of Franz Kafka's novel of 1915, The Trial. I like to think about them together, partially because of the clear affinities between them, but also because I think it helps to explain how and why we have come to represent and misrepresent Kafka's work to ourselves. If you look at the general cultural reaction to Kafka, as embodied, for instance, in the various film adaptations of his work, it seems that Kafka's vision has been confused with something else, something like George Orwell's 1984. That cultural effect, I think, is implicitly predicted in Foucault's writing. For Foucault, the Orwellian conception of the individual's relation to the state, in which the individual is subjected by a violent and centralized power, is precisely what maintains a general unconsciousness of how disciplinary power actually works. Among the various film excerpts in this video are clips from Orson Welles' 1962 adaptation of The Trial, as well as David Hugh Jones' 1993 film. There will also be excerpts from George Guidal's reading of the novel, published by Recorded Books. For many readers, the opening scene of The Trial is the most striking in the novel, possibly because it seems to emblematize in just a few pages the entirety of Joseph K's struggle throughout the drama. The novel begins with these words.
Someone must have slandered Joseph K. For one morning, without having done anything truly wrong, he was arrested. His landlady, Frau Grubach, had a cook who brought him breakfast each day around 8, but this time she didn't appear. That had never happened before. Kay waited a while longer, watching from his pillow the old woman who lived across the way, who was peering at him with a curiosity quite unusual for her. Then, both put out and hungry, he rang. There was an immediate knock at the door, and a man he'd never seen before in these lodgings entered. "Who are you?" asked Kay, and immediately sat halfway up in bed. But the man ignored the question as if his presence would have to be accepted, and merely said in turn, "You rang?" "Anna's to bring me breakfast," Kay said, scrutinizing him silently for a moment, trying to figure out who he might be. But the man didn't submit to his inspection for long, turning instead to the door and opening it a little in order to tell someone who was apparently standing just behind it, "He wants Anna to bring him breakfast." A short burst of laughter came from the adjoining room. It was hard to tell whether more than one person had joined in. Although the stranger could hardly have learned anything new from this, he nonetheless said to Kay, as if passing on a message, "It's impossible." "That's news to me," Kay said, jumping out of bed and quickly pulling on his trousers. "I'm going to find out what sort of people those are next door and how Frau Grubach can justify allowing this disturbance." Although he realized at once that he shouldn't have spoken aloud, and that by doing so he had, in a sense, acknowledged the stranger's right to oversee his actions, that didn't seem important at the moment. Still, the stranger took it that way, for he said, "Wouldn't you rather stay here?" "I have no wish to stay here, nor to be addressed by you until you've introduced yourself." "I meant well," the stranger said, and now opened the door of his own accord.
So there it is, the famous moment when the state first intrudes into Joseph K's privacy, just prior to informing him that he is under arrest for unknown reasons. But what actually happens here? For one thing, Joseph K is not awakened by the intruder, as depicted, for instance, in Orson Welles' beautiful adaptation of the novel. We meet K rather already awake, quote, put out and hungry, because the outer world has failed to serve him. This is the first of many indications that Joseph K is a complacent man on the outer brink of his youth. We learn later that this day is in fact his 30th birthday, and that this novel, on one level, depicts the crisis of a young man who imagines himself to be outside the established civic and social structure, forced to choose sides, to choose whether or not he is going to take seriously what he thinks is the game of civil society. Frequently overlooked in this scene of authoritarian invasion is the fact that the authorities do not enter Joseph K's privacy uninvited.
Then, both put out and hungry, he rang. There was an immediate knock at the door, and a man he'd never seen before in these lodgings entered. "You rang?"
The authorities who are part of the machinery of K's trial, his life trial as it were, have arrived at his summons. Now there are many critics who would object that we must dismiss the idea that K summons his trial in this way, because elsewhere in the novel it is asserted that the authorities had been sent to arrest K regardless, and that their manifestation upon K demanding his breakfast, demanding to be served by an outer world that had heretofore only mothered him, is therefore just a coincidence, a momentary illusion. But we have to remember that you can't read Kafka by the rules of ordinary realist fiction, where there is only one fixed and predetermined answer to the question of what is going on. It is an absolute cliché to say that Kafka's fiction unfolds with the logic of a dream, but it is also true. Consider, for instance, the dream you had last night, where you were riding in a train with your father to the World Fair. He was making you anxious about the trip because you hadn't yet secured a place to stay. Then later it turns out you're traveling with your chemistry teacher from high school, and you realize you forgot to turn in your assignment. Now, it is not the case that your subconscious mind had made some sort of mistake when you were dreaming you were traveling with your father, a mistake that was corrected when your teacher took the place of your father in the dream. It is not the case, in other words, that the later stages of your dream reveal the real story, the real facts of the dream world, whereas the earlier stages were errors of perception. Clearly, the scenario with your father was just as important to your subconscious as the scenario with your teacher. The themes, ideas, emotions, and relationships evoked by the one scene were just as important to your dream as the other. And it may well be that the first scenario required a factual arrangement of the world, or what narrative theorists call the diegetic reality of a fictional world, that is completely different from the factual diegetic reality required by the subsequent scenario. This is a fruitful way to read Kafka's fiction. When the trial goes out of its way to stage Joseph K's arrest as something that he himself has demanded with the ring of a bell, by the way, which will be evoked later when K hears a legend that the trials of all accused men are begun with the ringing of a bell, then we have to take seriously the statement the scene is making, that K himself is an indispensable engineer of the bewildering disciplinary procedures that he will encounter. Kafka underscores this point by suggesting that the guard that has entered his room, the official who literally opens the door to these proceedings, is a double of Joseph K himself. Partially because of the autobiographical nature of almost everything Kafka writes, scholars have long understood Joseph K's trials to reflect Kafka's own. So when K is ushered into his trial by a man named Franz, the signal is pretty clear. And it is comically amplified when, after the guard named Willem tells K that he shouldn't annoy them because they are, quote, probably the human beings closest to you now, Franz chimes in with, "That's right, you better believe it," and gives K a, quote, long and no doubt meaningful look. The moment we picture this scene in which K then, quote, allows himself to become involved in an involuntary staring match with Franz, Kafka's understanding of who it is that initiates K's disciplinary trial becomes clear. As the opening scene of the novel unfolds, K gets up, puts on his trousers, exchanges some words with the guard, and walks into the adjoining room, the living room of his motherly landlady, Frau Grubach, where he encounters another guard. They tell him he is being held, that proceedings are underway, and that he'll learn everything he needs to know in due time. They seem to encourage bribes from K, telling him his nice clothes would be better in their keeping while he's under arrest.
What sort of men were they? What were they talking about? What office did they represent? After all, K lived in a state governed by law. There was universal peace. All statutes were in force. Who dared assault him in his own lodgings? He'd always tended to take things lightly, to believe the worst only when it arrived, making no provision for the future, even when things looked bad. But that didn't seem the right approach here. Of course, he could treat the whole thing as a joke, a crude joke his colleagues at the bank were playing on him for some unknown reason. Perhaps because today was his 30th birthday. That was certainly possible. Perhaps all he had to do was laugh in the guards' faces, and they would laugh with him. Perhaps they were porters off the street corner. They looked a little like porters. Nevertheless, from the moment he'd first seen the guard named Franz, he had decided firmly that this time he wouldn't let even the slightest advantage he might have over these people slip through his fingers. Kay knew there was a slight risk someone might say later that he hadn't been able to take a joke, but he clearly recalled, although he generally didn't make it a practice to learn from experience, a few occasions, unimportant in themselves, when, unlike his friends, he had deliberately behaved quite recklessly, without the least regard for his future, and had suffered the consequences. That wasn't going to happen again. Not this time, at any rate. If this was a farce, he was going to play along. He was still free.
This young man's 30th birthday confronts him with a pressing question. Is he going to take seriously the world of established society, which is also the real dog-eat-dog world of power and corruption, from which he has always felt aloof and independent? Or is he going to maintain his vision of it as an absurd joke, as a young man does? His decision at this point is to try to have it both ways. He thinks of himself that he was still free, and he plans to remain free and independent of this outer world by playing along, as he says, merely performing as a disciplined subject of the state, a state that the novel simply refers to as the court, although the court also represents society in general. Kay plans to hold it at a distance and hide his smirk at the farcical world. At this point in the scene, Kay goes on the offensive and tries to beat the system at its own game. He will show these men his, quote, identification papers, and will demand theirs in turn. And here Kafka treats us to a comedy that will be imitated in 1,000 ways throughout the 20th century, right up to the present day. Kay has faith that there must exist a document somewhere that justifies his very existence, that proves to the authorities that he is, in fact, an authorized human being. And as he ransacks his desk to find such a document, he produces in triumph his bicycle license. But he realizes he needs something more, and therefore grabs his birth certificate as well, the paper that represents that most hallowed of moments when his body was first inscribed into the bureaucratic machinery of the state. But when he thrusts these documents at the guards and demands their paperwork, they react exactly as an arresting officer in our world would react if you insisted on your right to know his name and badge number.
"Good heavens," said the guard, "you just can't accept your situation. You seem bent on annoying us unnecessarily, although we're probably the human beings closest to you now. You're behaving worse than a child. What is it you want? We're lowly employees who can barely make our way through such documents. That's all we are. But we're smart enough to realize that before ordering such an arrest, the higher authorities who employ us inform themselves in great detail about the person they're arresting and the grounds for the arrest. There's been no mistake. After all, our department, as far as I know, and I know only the lowest level, doesn't seek out guilt among the general population, but, as the law states, is attracted by guilt, and has to send us guards out. That's the law. What mistake could there be?